Hello everyone, my name's Sophie Black and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Wheeler Centre for today's lunchtime event entitled Reporting the Gender Reckoning, which is sounds promisingly ominous. Now before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the Kulin Nation, a place now known by its European name of Melbourne. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and I acknowledge that this land was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now, in October last year, the New York Times published the first story alleging decades of sexual misconduct from Hollywood heavyweight Harvey Weinstein. Enter Who's the Boss's Alyssa Milano with a tweet that read, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write me too as a reply to this tweet." Yes, it seems like an unlikely way for a movement to be born, and of course the Me Too hashtag was actually first launched in 2006 by civil rights activist Tarana Burke, but the Me Too moniker has stuck, and unlike other hashtags, it doesn't seem to be disappearing anytime soon. The Weinstein revelations and the Me Too momentum dovetailed with the launch of a New York Times initiative that had already been in the works, the Gender Initiative. Our first guest today is Francesca Donner, director of that newly launched Gender Initiative. Francesca is responsible for setting and executing the strategic vision of the Gender Initiative. And for a vital local perspective, we have writer Matilda Dixon-Smith. Matilda is a writer, editor and cultural critic. Her work appears regularly in The Guardian, Fairfax, Crikey, SBS, Vice, many other outlets, too numerous to name, and she's published widely read responses to the Me Too phenomenon on Junkie. Please welcome them both. Francesca, let's just start with that New York Times story. The stories about Harvey Weinstein had been circulating for years, if not decades. Media outlets had either attempted to cover the story and backed away. Some stories had been published and then been sort of drowned out. What was it about this story? What was about this moment that meant the New York Times could publish what they did?
Right, okay. So let's go back a tiny bit. So you had a lot of things going on in the US at that time. You had Trump, who had just become president. And as you are probably all aware, there were sexual harassment allegations that bubbled up over the course of the election. So that was the first thing. So you had a pretty interesting political backdrop. And then we had also been doing some work in the Times against another pretty major media figure, Bill O'Reilly. And we had found that the extent of the payments and cover-ups were really extraordinary. And I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear that sexual harassment was going on, but it kind of got people thinking, okay, this really is big, and what's the next angle that we're going to look at? And Harvey, as you had mentioned, had been an open secret for a very long time. It was a known thing. People probably made jokes about it. And so that seemed like a pretty interesting place to get started. We had two reporters working on it, Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohy. And the two of them got going with the work, and it was a very, very, very hard thing to report. They needed to firstly get people willing to talk to them. They needed to talk to staffers who had been working with Harvey over the years, and they needed to talk to, they wanted to talk to these actresses who had suffered at his hands. And one of the things that they said actually was that getting the actresses, they couldn't access the actresses through managers or agents because so many of the stories had been quashed before. They needed to get them directly. And so they're sitting there going, how do you get Angelina Jolie on the phone? How do you get Ashley Judd on the phone? Where do we even begin? And Megan actually had experience working with the women who had spoken out against Trump. And so she had a lot of experience sort of bringing people around to trust her, and really working with them directly one-on-one. And so this was a lot of the work that they did. They reported this over a very long period of time, talking with them, meeting with them, sitting with them one-on-one, and really sort of understanding their stories. And one of the things that they said to these women was, and I think this is a really great point, look, we can't change what you have experienced, but we can change the landscape for women going forward. And I think that was a really big part of getting women to talk. A lot of these people also had signed NDAs, and they essentially had to get these women to break their NDAs. And what they said to that was, look, one signs an NDA to protect, a company's, confidential secrets, but this is abuse. Surely you didn't sign this NDA to protect, outright abuse. That's the behavior that's just blatantly wrong. And so I think that was another way for people to sort of look at that and say, yeah, I'm not gonna let that muzzle me. I am gonna speak out. And so they were getting all of these stories, and of course, at the same time, they were doing a whole ton of sort of behind-the-scenes legwork and looking into paper trails, payments, memos, trying to figure out all of the different people who had been complicit in this whole machine, lawyers, PR people. And then at the same time, they had a lot of sort of he said, she said stories. And in those cases where there wasn't a paper trail, they said, well, was there anyone who you talked to at the time? Did you tell your friend? Did you tell your mother? Did you write an email about it? And in those cases, if there had been someone who these people had confided in, they would track those people down. What happened? Tell me what she said. Was there an email or something? And really sort of get the backstory on that. So there was a lot of really deep reporting going on behind the scenes, in addition to sort of the stories that you read about on the, in the actual story. And another thing that they I promise I won't keep going forever, but another thing that they really remarked on was just how similar all the stories were. I mean, they all had sort of variations to them, but essentially, it was just a machine of getting the woman to the hotel room and sort of orchestrating all of that, and the story was always seemed to be the same, that it was this flattering, you're so talented, you can really go places, come and meet me at this hotel room. And then you had, the assistants and whoever who was sort of making sure that the person got to the hotel room, or there would be, a fax received with the instructions of what they had to do. And then all of, everything kind of went down from there. But it was really just what they found, a similar story again and again and again being told.
And then this is all against the backdrop of coming up against the immense power of this man. I mean, this is a man who hired ex-Israeli spies to intimidate some of his victims. At what point did he catch wind of the fact that this was going on, that this work was going on?
Well, it's sort of also, at what point did we catch wind that he knew what was going on? And I think, I get the feeling that Harvey always knows everything, but what they did say is over the course of the summer, by the way, the story broke probably in early October. So over the course of the summer, when they were reporting on the story, they found that just Harvey had really brought out the big guns in terms of legal, PR. A lot of the women who they were talking to also had colleagues who they had worked with from 20 years prior, making phone calls saying, "Oh, don't speak on the record," to the New York Times. So they were aware that this was happening, but also all of this set in motion was a sign that, okay, we are actually really onto something.
So obviously the kind of the work involved in that investigation, the revelations, the kind of accumulation of accusations, and the fact that this was clearly an institutionalized form of abuse in many ways. It was an extraordinary story, but there have been extraordinary stories of abuse published before. Why did this resonate in the way that it did? And I'd like to hear from both of you on that question.
Okay, well, sorry, you have to hear more from me. And then you will hear from Matilda, who's amazing. So I've been thinking about that a lot, actually, this week. And I think I think in big part it had to do with the fact that there were famous people, and that's really a tiresome answer. But when you have famous people, you sort of feel this sense of sort of familiarity. You feel like you kind of know them, even though you don't. You've seen them on the screen. Maybe you've seen them on your TV, which in some way means they've kind of been in your house, which is sort of weird. But I was thinking about it actually this morning. So I went to, I hope I don't mess this up. I went to the National Gallery of Victoria, NGV.
Correct. Very good.
And when I was there, I was looking at all the amazing work in the triennial, and they had one really interesting series of films. And the films were, they had two celebrities. They had Julianne Moore and they had Alec Baldwin telling the stories of refugees. And they were gigantic on a big screen with a big sort of green backdrop behind them. And they were not, they were clearly recognizable. And it was very, very arresting. The screen was huge, bigger than the stage. And I stopped and I listened to, Alec Baldwin saying these stories, and you really felt them. And they weren't even necessarily they were acting a little bit, but they were really just kind of getting that message across. And I stopped and I listened and I listened. And then I went through to the back room, and behind this gigantic screen, there were probably maybe six smaller screens, and there were the real people, also against these colorful backgrounds, telling their stories. Beautiful, wonderful, awful tragedy right there in front of your eyes. And I think what was so interesting was that it had been the celebrities who we recognized. Oh, look, it's Julia. Oh, look, it's Alec Baldwin, who had stopped us or stopped me anyway in my tracks. And, then I sat up and listened. And you almost felt, and I think this was part of the design of the show, right? But you almost felt that you didn't see the other people, and it put you in a very uncomfortable position where you sort of realize, no, those are the stories, those are the people. But I think it's sort of the same thing, and of course now we're in a different place now where those silent anonymous stories are starting to come out, and you have Me Too is this giant microphone on it all. Anyway.
Matilda, would you agree with that?
I do. I agree with Fran. I think it's hard to, and this is speaking as a journalist and a member of the public, it is hard to get the public to care about a story that's about someone they don't recognise. And I would think about telling stories about refugees, which is a hard point of interest for the public to care about at this point. And, if we're telling stories about refugees, the refugee crisis on Manus Island, at Junkie, for example, that will have a pretty low level of interest on the website. But if we're telling the story about Russell Crowe tweeting about the crisis on Manus Island, suddenly the level of interest ups, 100%, because we're like, oh, Russell Crowe's interested in it. Okay, I'm interested in it, because why is Russell Crowe interested in it? And I think, that doesn't necessarily say it's a slightly cynical point of view, but it's just because we're like recognising Russell Crowe, so we're saying, okay, well, why is Russell Crowe interested? And I think it is a point of recognisability. But I think the other thing is, it's just, these are powerful people, and these are from our perspective, they're powerful women who have had power exerted over them as well. So we're going, okay, well, if these women are subject to these forms of abuse as well, then what about us? And I think that's an interesting point of entry for us as well, to look at women in higher positions of power being subject to these abuses, and then how that kind of trickles down to us and to even to women who are in positions of power lower than us as well. So yeah, I think that's kind of how the movement exploded. But I also think it's just, the position that we're in now as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago in terms of this gender reporting and talking about these things. I think being somebody who writes about gender, and I think, Fran, you might agree, is something that is far easier for me to do now than it was 5 years ago. And not just because of Me Too, but, even in the past 2 years as opposed to 5 years ago, it's just something that people are interested in.
I want to talk more about that amazing fundamental shift. But before we get to that, a little bit about the Me Too hashtag, the second iteration of Me Too that came out of this. I think there is, as you say, a bit of cynicism about celebrities leading a movement like this, and there's real cynicism around hashtags and the shelf life of a hashtag. But this really seems to have resonated beyond other campaigns that we've seen before. But I mean, Matilda, for example, I know that you expressed initially ambivalence about it. Do you want to explain a few reasons why, and if you still think that way or you've changed your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of genuine and legitimate criticisms about Me Too. I think that there's a lot of privilege behind being able to put forward your own story of abuse. Some people aren't able to do that for a number of reasons, you know, because they've signed an NDA, because they're still in a position of where they're subject to abuse and they're not able to speak out about it because it's just really difficult to speak out about abuse and they feel unsafe about it. They feel like they're not in a position where they're comfortable to do so. Sometimes if you're a victim of abuse, you still feel the trauma and it's just really difficult to speak out or to see others speaking out about it. As a survivor, I felt really uncomfortable when Me Too started because you just have all of these stories sort of flying at your face everywhere you look. You know, it was on Facebook, it was on Twitter, it was on Instagram, it was in the street, so that's quite difficult. And I think that was a thing that a lot of trauma survivors felt really uncomfortable about. And then there were the kind of offshoots where it was circling back to men, which was another thing that people felt uncomfortable about, where it was like, I'm a man and I'm going to talk about how maybe I have harassed a woman and I feel bad about it, and then they were hijacking the movement, which is a thing that happens quite often with female empowerment movements.
And they were applauded for that.
Yeah.
Admission.
Yeah, which is a really unfortunate thing that happens. I mean, it's all very well and quite useful for men to like recognise their part in Me Too and how important it is for them to notice that they are a part of it in a negative way, but they shouldn't hijack a movement. So I think all of those reasons meant that it was a difficult movement for a lot of people to come to terms with. But I do think that just the sustainable power of the movement and how it keeps spreading and how it keeps evolving and finding new ways for people to come to terms with it and, you know, pull it into their own lives and into their own movements and their own ways of kind of fighting and moving forward and healing and dealing with their own trauma. All of that is really important, and I think it kind of speaks to the power of this moment, to be honest. So it did kind of resolve a lot of my issues with it initially.
What do you think, Francesca? I mean, have you seen, obviously with the gender initiative, which we'll get into, but there was criticism around, you know, the narrow scope of the Me Too. Well, it's not really a movement. It's obviously a set of very disparate points of views and experiences. But I know that with the gender initiative, for example, you have a newsletter called the Me Too Moment. I think it is. So have you seen unexpected conversations shake out of that and watched it develop and sort of the ripple effect?
Yeah. I mean, definitely to speak to the. I mean, I think the newsletter is sort of a newsroom product of this thing and this moment, and I sort of think, you know, when we think about the Me Too movement or moment or whatever we're going to call it, you're right. It's far from perfect. It's incredibly painful, but I sort of think for me, as I look at it, you have a couple of things that are quite interesting that's coming out of it. One is this feeling that so many women can actually come, and men too, some men, but mostly women, can come forward and really express what they're feeling and be listened to. And all of those sort of anonymous stories, quiet stories that might have been whispered to a friend, sort of rolled into this massive thing, become a deafening roar. And what I was talking about with someone the other day is that you can't put all of these stories back in a box now. You know, I mean, this is out there, and, you know, it's impossible for us to hear, you know, you can hear the stories of a friend or someone you're close with or sort of people in your immediate sort of vicinity, but you can't hear everybody's stories from all over the world. But now we have sort of this sense of the scope of that. So I think that's quite interesting, that's kind of come out of this. And then, you know, as far as our newsletter goes, please, by the way, please sign up for it. As far as that goes, that was actually really a way for us. I mean, on our gender team and a lot of the other reporters around the New York Times, we were sort of looking at this. You know, it kind of started with Harvey, but, you know, we use words like avalanche and tsunami and the dominoes falling to describe what happened after. And I think There was so much going on, and there was so much to kind of make sense of and parse through, not just the news stories that were breaking, not just at the New York Times, but across all manner of media, but really sort of what does this mean for me? How do people feel about it? We were having trouble kind of making sense of that. So I guess the newsletter that we launched was sort of our answer to trying to figure this out with everybody else, because we didn't have the answers. Our job in the newsroom is to tell the stories and find the stories and shed light on them. But we didn't have the answers any better than anybody else did. We were figuring it out. And one of the things we did do in that is one of the issues of that newsletter, we asked some of our readers to share poetry, thoughts, beautiful artwork, and we got so much response to that. I mean, people were feeling it, and we got wonderful pieces from all over the world, and someone from Australia as well. But I think just, that also is starting to give us a sense of the scope of what was going on in the conversations that people were having, and the feelings that people had, and sort of providing an outlet for people to kind of express themselves. I mean, I think that's all what's going on here. It's people have found this outlet, and Me Too is just the name we give it. It's so much more than that.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's one of the things that's honestly the most interesting thing about the movement and the kind of media, the way the media is responding to it and continues to respond to it, is the media is learning as fast as the movement moves, or even sometimes a little bit more slowly. But that's honestly a really interesting thing to look at, to notice how the media is adapting to how the movement goes. We're learning as fast as everybody in the public is. And, when something happens and the media responds to it, that in itself is as interesting and kind of informative as anything. And when things like the babe.net Aziz Ansari sort of debacle happens and the media responds to that, or when there's a discussion about backlash or generational divide happens, and then there's a discussion within the media and outside of the media in the public about that, all of that stuff is interesting and informative and helps the movement evolve even further. And so it's kind of a really, I suppose, useful and illustrative, collaborative thing that's happening between the media and the public, and even involving the entertainment industry, which is kind of feels like the epicenter in both a cynical and kind of informative way. It's like Hollywood's the center of everything, and that's really boring. But it's also just Hollywood's a useful illustrative example that we can see, some good things and bad things happening in the movement, and take that and apply it more broadly into what's happening in our everyday lives, and maybe learn some lessons from that.
I imagine when it comes to the gender initiative, that you have to build that responsiveness into that initiative and keep up with all of those discussions and feed that into what you're doing. Tell us a bit about the initiative. What was the timing on that? I mean, it extends way beyond a Me Too newsletter. It sounds way more ambitious in scope. What was the impetus for it, and what was the timing around it? Because I imagine you were, hatching ideas way before, Harvey Weinstein happened.
Well, yeah, we felt that one of the big pushes right now in the New York Times is to do a really good job on diversity. So part of diversity is gender, race issues, and just trying to do a really good job of making sure that different views and perspectives are represented, not just in who is telling in the reporters who are telling the stories, but also in the stories that we are choosing to tell. And so for gender, this was something that had emerged as a totally essential topic that, of course, we were already covering, but that we could do a whole lot more with. And the other thing we felt about gender was that it really it crossed country lines, if you will. It seemed to be something that was quite resonant globally, and that made it quite interesting for us. So the idea of the gender initiative was sort of ongoing, and we pulled together the team.
How big is the team?
The team is tiny. The team is so small. The team could fit in these 3 chairs, basically, and that's not a joke. But the team is broader than that too. So we have there are 3 of us on the core team. We have a news assistant. We have me. I'm the gender director, and then we have a gender editor. Jessica Bennett, who's phenomenal and wrote a great book called Feminist Fight Club. I hope you've read it. So that's the core team, but it was absolutely imperative that this was a really sort of newsroom-wide, organization-wide initiative. And so we have a ton of reporters who are working with us. We're working with the opinion section to some extent, although we're actually squarely based in the newsroom, and really sort of working across desks to make sure that gender is this lens that we apply to all the stories that we're already telling. So, gender as it crosses culture, sport, politics, you name it, any story that the New York Times is covering, there may well be a sort of gender angle in it. And of course, gender also in a very sort of specific, pointed way, which, can include all manner of things, but it could be, identity, sexuality, masculinity, women's issues, trans issues, all of that. Really trying to sort of squarely look at that, but also look at all of those things. We like to say that gender is this lens through which we view the world, and so really placing that lens on all the work that we're already doing.
That is extraordinarily ambitious in terms of, if you think about the news and how embedded the white male perspective is in every headline, every news item, news story on TV, in the script, it's embedded into absolutely everything, a certain tone. And women's issues, we're so used to it being relegated to, a certain section of a paper or a website, or more likely in a glossy magazine with curly font and a pink tinge. How much have you experienced any resistance in the newsroom, or how much is it about changing the perspectives of that editorial team to rethink the way they frame a story or an angle to a story?
Yeah, okay. So you raised a really great point, which is sort of one of the things we need to do, and I hope lots of newsrooms will do, is sort of look quite critically at how we are presenting the news. So it can be as subtle as who is represented in a photo. Is it always a man? Is it always a white man? Is it a woman? Or who do we choose to quote in our stories? Do we always end up quoting Dr. Mark so-and-so, or are we quite careful to get a balance of people who we quote in our stories, and really looking at sort of who is the main subject of the story? I mean, sometimes it's going to be a man. If the story is about Trump, the main subject is going to be a man. But it doesn't always have to be that way. So I think the first thing is taking quite a critical look at sort of the work we're doing and making sure that the work we do more accurately represents the world that we live in. That's one thing. In terms of resistance, unless people are being quite nice to me, I've experienced zero resistance. I mean, I think this is just essential for us if we want to be a good news organization. It's something we have to do. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's also, you can look at it from a business perspective and say, if we want to have a big audience of readers, we need to appeal to a big audience of readers. And that's much more than a small subset of society. We need to be doing journalism that accurately reflects the world out there. And that means coming at it from a diverse view of angles and making sure that they're represented.
How much do you think that, and that is a very online sensibility in a lot of ways. We've come a long way in the last decade in terms of the impenetrable arrogance, for want of a better word, of a masthead, and the fact that they have the authority and the audience is separate to the editorial decisions. In terms of that online phenomenon, I mean, how much do both of you think that the way that we're seeing women speak and write about themselves, and also the way that they are received in the news or portrayed in the news, how much does that come down to that uniquely online sensibility?
I mean, I think there's still a lot of struggle, and I think that it just comes down to who's at the top and who's kind of giving space to whom. And I think that that's something that still needs to be really addressed, and initiatives like this are a really great way of saying, actually, we're going to, insert a different perspective and disrupt that this person's at the top and they're filtering down perspective and giving space to XYZ, and XYZ is male. and the person at the top is male. But I do think that, you know, the great thing about online is that so much is given away for free, and unfortunately, a lot of the people giving things away for free are women. And so, you know, news outlets now are facing the unfortunate responsibility of saying, well, if everyone can get their news for free and I want them to pay for it, what are the ways that I can get people to pay for it? So yeah, as you're saying, it becomes then a business decision where they're looking around and saying, what are people wanting to pay for now? And, you know, people want these diverse opinions, and, you know, they want just more intersectionality in their writing. And so I think that it is a really important thing, the online landscape. Just how much is available for free means that people have to find innovative ways of drawing customers in and getting them to pay for it. And, you know, Sophie, it's like we were talking about with something like Crikey, where just disrupting that older mode of selling that product has really drawn in a new kind of customer for that business. And, you know, that's great for them.
I think, sorry, may I answer
You
that
may,
question too?
please.
I think you know, the digital landscape has sort of changed everything, because you get a lot of trolls, you get a lot of feedback, but you also get a lot of feedback, and that's the point, right? So you can, I mean, we hear directly every day from, you know, hundreds, if maybe thousands of readers. And, you know, it used to sort of be whoever actually bothered to sit down and write a letter and put it in the post box, and, you know, if someone would open it on the other end, and then somehow that would be processed. But now, I mean, the sort of rush of voices and opinions, it's phenomenal, and it's helpful, and it gives you a whole lot of sense how people are feeling about you, whether they love you or they don't like you or they don't agree with the decision that you made. And, you know, and it comes from every single side. And I think that that's absolutely essential, I feel like, to how we do our jobs. One of the things, I don't want to get too off topic, but one of the things we started at the Times is called the Reader Centre, and it was just started last year. And the idea of the Reader Centre is basically to sort of be a clearinghouse almost for all of this reader feedback that was coming in, and it allowed us to really kind of hear some of the concerns that were bubbling up and actually get editors to respond to those things and say, look, this is why we made this decision, now you understand, or we hear you and you might be right, maybe we did make a mistake and we'll correct for that, or, you know, I feel like that's so essential, and that it's a wonderful thing, and it's a troubling thing as well, because you also get sort of the elevation of really unpleasant voices, and that can be very, very, very painful for, you know, reporters and writers. I'm sure you experience some real nastiness out there, but I think overall, looking at it, we would much rather hear from people and get a sense of who's out there and who's reading, and also have a much better sense of how much people are watching and looking and analysing and thinking about this stuff.
There's also been a bit of talk lately about whether or not we've tapped out the kind of confessional op-ed, whether we've reached peak confessional opinion piece. And for example, we had Julia Turner from Slate out here last year, and she talked about the fact that it was a real concern that young journalists were encouraged by editors to kind of bare their soul and tell the most personal story about themselves that they possibly could. And then those journalists found that it made things harder for them, down the track, that piece would either tail them wherever they went, or the editor would not be interested in their less salacious or entertaining stuff that didn't generate as many hits. And then, Matilda, you mentioned the piece about Aziz Ansari that was published on babe.net that was generated a lot of controversy. How do you balance this very valid, very illuminating kind of thirst for confessional pieces with traditional journalistic ethics?
I think it is about, the thing with the Babe piece is that wasn't a first-person piece. That was written by a journalist in the third person, and that journalist didn't use proper journalistic ethics. She didn't check her sources. She wrote it poorly.
We should probably, pass the piece just for people, if people aren't familiar with it. I can't remember the headline. What was it?
it was something like, I went on a date with Aziz Ansari and it was the worst night of my life or something. And, babe.net, which is a sort of, this is going to sound mean. It's like a low-rent Jezebel. It's like a low... That's mean.
Yeah, it sounds mean.
Yeah, that's mean. It's like a women's, young women's website for sort of like Gen Z millennial women. They wrote a piece, a woman who had alleged that Aziz Ansari had sexually assaulted her, Babe had tracked her down and gotten her to tell them about what had happened and then had written about it. They didn't check sources. They didn't sort of check her facts. I don't think they approached Aziz and asked him about it. They just sort of published the piece, and it was told in the third person by another journalist. And then when a lot of other people came out and sort of said, I don't know that this was the right way to report on this story, which, it probably wasn't, they went full, on the defensive about it and doubled down. And, I'm not sure, that's just not the right way, I think, to, and you would probably agree, because that's not the way that the New York Times reports on these stories, and that's not the way that anybody else who's been reporting on these stories does. And I think it's quite similar to what happened here with Geoffrey Rush and the Daily Telegraph. That was a similar situation where they wanted to get a Me Too story, they wanted to get that byline, they jumped the gun, and they could have, ruined that story for those people, because it's like, you've got to check your sources, you've got to make sure you've got the story before you pull the trigger. And I think, you can't judge whether or not it's true because you don't have everything there, but you've got to make sure you check your facts, and you've got to make sure you use these journalistic standards that have been there for decades, no matter if you're writing online or writing in print. They're the rules, and they're there for a reason.
I imagine you're grappling with these issues in the New York Times. Yes.
Yeah.
There are a few pieces that have been, the way that they have been received in the wake of this Me Too phenomenon has been fascinating. Another piece that set the internet on fire was the short story in the New Yorker entitled Cat Person, an account of a murky sexual relationship from the point of view of a young woman. And the responses to that story were either kind of triumphant shouts of recognition, and they mainly came from younger women, or complete bafflement, like, why is this a thing? Why is this story being received so well? Why are we all talking about this? Have you both noticed a generational divide when it comes to responses around anything to do with Me Too and this so-called grey area?
Yeah, definitely. I think also Cat Person is a really interesting story because it's fiction, but it's done its job in that it's sort of got the conversation going in the way that the Aziz story also got the conversation going, but it was really troubling, as you pointed out, in the sort of the journalistic ethics, whether they were there or not, and sort of journalistic standards not being followed at all. But I think that Cat Person is so interesting because it's fiction, and it just shows how it can sort of unlock the box of thoughts and ideas and sort of get the conversation going. But to answer your question, for sure, I think it was sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but it might even kind of mark the start of the sort of generational rift in Me Too, which I think sort of really broadly defined, and this is really broad, you had sort of the younger generation, younger people saying, everything is sexual harassment. You touch me on my elbow, if that feels like sexual harassment to me, that's sexual harassment. And then you had, very broadly speaking, and I'm really speaking broadly, the older generation who were saying, are you kidding? Get up, stand up on your legs, walk out of the apartment. If you don't like what's happening, you just say no, it's easy to say. And the younger women were sort of saying, why are you not reading my cues? Why are you not sensitive enough to realize this? Unless I say, yes, enthusiastically, unless I give you my enthusiastic consent, that actually does mean no. And again, the older generation was sort of saying, look, if you young people start acting like that, we're going to revert back to sort of the Victorian era of ladies fainting on couches. That's not something that we're willing to go back to. So I think that sort of is the way I see the rift right now. I actually would really love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, we did a bit of work for a piece at Crikey, actually, on the kind of changing language around consent after Cat Person and the Aziz Ansari piece. I did notice that there was a bit of a generational divide and also just a lot of confusion about, what consent is, what enthusiastic consent is, like what people think no and yes means, how we even give consent and all of this sort of thing. So I spoke to, some crisis support workers. I spoke to someone at Women's Legal Aid in New South Wales. I spoke to a sex educator and I spoke to a linguist as well. And there was this just huge division in opinion in terms of like how we resolve this idea of how people give consent in sex. And I think the most interesting perspective came from the linguist who said that sex is the only instance, apart from when you're talking on the phone to somebody from a call centre, where we have to give explicit yes and no answers. Because if you think about it, you don't. Say if somebody calls, if somebody says, do you want to come to a party, and you don't particularly want to go, you say, maybe, we'll see. I don't know, I might have something on. We'll see how we go. I'd like to come. And we all know that means you're probably not going to go. But, when somebody asks you if you want to come back and have sex with them and you say, maybe, I don't know, we'll see. I don't know how I feel about it, because you feel really uncomfortable because we actually don't like saying no to each other. That's the worst thing you could possibly say. And suddenly we're all saying to people, no, you need to explicitly say no. And apparently when it comes to sex, we just don't know how to read genuine social cues that we understand in any other social context. So I think it's also just about learning to interact with each other properly again. And that was a thing that the sex educator, really wanted to reinforce from a very young age again, was just this idea of learning to kind of communicate with each other again better. And this idea of kind of like a scale of consent, not just yes and no, but different ways of reading cues that aren't just explicit yes, explicit no, but body cues and, half yeses and half nos, and just checking in with each other and checking that little things are okay and touches are okay and that kind of thing. And I think it's just about education and interaction and that kind of thing. And I think, I do think it's a bit of a difficult situation because, we have had these huge ins and outs and gaps as we've gone along in eras and generations. But I think, there's so obviously a problem now. I think we do all need to come together, even if we have these divides in generational knowledge, and kind of find a new way of working through this, because it's a problem whether or not you're 75 or 25 or 15 or 5. So yeah.
I also think, and I think that the other really interesting thing about Cat Person also was, you had this protagonist, and by the way, you should read it, it's a good story. You had this protagonist who not only wasn't able to sort of get the words out, but also was in this position of feeling really worried about offending someone else's feelings and sort of depressing her own feelings so that this other guy, and things had kind of sort of progressed to this place where she thought, how do I go back? It's so awkward now for me to stand up and say, actually, I'm not interested.
Yeah, that's the thing. We don't like to say no. We don't like to
and it
offend
was this feeling of, I don't want to hurt his feelings, which was sort of what was really remarkably interesting, I think, about that story.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we forget about all other social cues when it comes to sex. It's just a really interesting thing. But yeah, this linguist who was saying this to me when I was interviewing her just sort of illuminated this thing I had never really considered before. That was very interesting.
I think along with this really amazing introspection that we're seeing and talking about all of these issues that have been prompted by this metoo conversation and the news coverage in this particular moment, is a really fundamental shift in how victims of abuse are received and portrayed in the media in a massive way. Like, I imagine the women at the centre of the New York Times investigation and the New Yorker investigation were weighing up whether it was worth coming forward, because they've seen all the women before them come out and make accusations and tell their story and have been completely torn down by the media. There's a few kind of retellings of 90s stories, 90s news stories at the moment, like Tonya Harding, Monica Lewinsky has been in the news recently, Nicole Brown. If you think back to those stories, and they were sort of at the cusp of the start of that 24-hour news cycle, but you think about the way those women were portrayed, can you imagine them being portrayed in that same way now? Has there been a fundamental shift that means we won't go back, or am I being too optimistic?
I don't know. I can't see the future. I don't know if there's a fundamental shift that means we won't go back. But I think what we are seeing right now is I mean, to your point, exactly, just a different landscape where people can speak out and they're being heard, and the most crucial thing is they're being believed. So you even look at the Babe story, where it was just, of course, I'm not saying we would have published it, but in that way at all. But this story was just sort of rolled out on the internet, and one was in a position where one had to believe her side. That was what had been presented. So I think different people are sort of approaching this in different ways. But I do think we've gotten to this place where where those voices are really being heard, being taken seriously, and. It's not that long ago that we were covering the women who had spoken out against Donald Trump, and we had broken a story saying these women experienced harassment, and then I don't know. I feel like the Harvey thing kind of just put a stick in the ground and said, okay, enough is enough. And I think a lot of women said that. And I do feel like, at least for now, you never know if you're going to go back. But I do feel like at least for now, I think that these stories are being told in a very different way. I'm really interested to see what will happen with Bill Cosby's retrial, which is coming up. I think that story was well covered in the US, but times are different now, and I am very, very curious to see how that's going to look different this time around.
Matilda, from a local perspective, do you think there's been a fundamental shift?
I mean, it's a little bit different from a local perspective because we just have different laws about defamation and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think what concerns me more than how we view the women in these stories is how we view the men in these stories. I think that's a really concerning thing, and that was something that I noticed a lot, when I was watching the Oscars on Monday here, is just how short a memory we have on these men who have, perpetrated these abuses. And if you think about something like a local story that's happened here, like the Craig McLaughlin story, how quickly that cycle turned around to him getting a full page spread in the Sunday style section of, I think, a Herald Sun or whatever, saying, woe is me, this has destroyed my life, and we're not going to play judge and jury on whether or not he did what he did, but does he deserve a full page spread in the style section saying, this is really hard for me? Probably not. And I think that's something that we really need to be wary of, is like, how do we give these men these chances to redeem themselves before, he hasn't been charged, he hasn't gone to trial, none of that's happened, and he's already allowed to turn around and try and give himself his own redemption cycle. I'm not sure that that's something that needs to happen, and I think that is something we need to be wary on, is how quickly we forgive these men before they've even been, proven innocent or guilty. That's something I think we do need to be very careful of.
Maybe we need a gender initiative in every newsroom here as well.
Maybe
we need to copy that concept. I'm going to throw to the audience now. So if you have a burning question, please put your hand high into the air, and we have a couple of roving mics that we can get to you. I can see a hand down the front here. Oh, yeah.
One of the things with Weinstein was it was just so blatant and easy to see where the line was, so you knew he was a really bad guy. One of the reactions to that I'm observing, particularly in a corporate environment, is men who are not in that predator environment, now becoming very concerned about where their line is and how they will relate to the women they work with. And particularly when we get headlines, as we have in the last few weeks, about others, our politicians and the personal relationships they have, that, which means that have we got the potential for this to harm women's careers because we've got that Mike Pence attitude that I won't engage with any woman in a work environment that in the same way I would engage with a man in a work environment, and how is that conversation going to play out so that we create a new norm that that allows men who are trying to do the right thing be comfortable in their interactions, particularly in a business or a work environment with the women they work with.
I hope we don't get to an environment where women and men are scared to work together. That is not a good outcome. But I think to look at this, to take the positive side of this, I think what is really exciting, exciting in quotes, is that, fine, we had to start with Hollywood, and we had to start with the glamour and but all of this red carpet is now trickling down to our daily lives, as you point out. And I think what this has done is unleash these conversations that we're having in our workplaces, that men, certainly men I know, ordinary men who are not glamorous or special or celebrities, are having those conversations with each other, with women, and even internally themselves wondering, what does this mean? How does this make somebody feel? And not even just God, have I done the wrong thing my whole life? But also, because maybe they haven't, but also, what's it like to feel like a woman? What's it like when, it never occurred to me that, women are talked over in meetings. It never occurred to me that, the woman is always the one who's asked to get the coffee, or who's asked to take the notes, or who's asked to do the party planning. It never occurred to me that women take on so much of the mental load at home, by which I mean, even if they have help, they're the ones who are deciding who the pediatrician will be, or what's on the grocery list, or all of those things. And I think it's also to an extent made women stop in their tracks, and instead of accepting all of these things, really question, what are these norms? What are the norms that we have in this workplace? What are the norms that I have in my household? What does this mean? Things that we for so long have said, it's just the way it is. Oh, it's just Harvey being Harvey. It's just the way the world, it's just the office. That's just the way things are. Kind of taking a really critical look at the office, or at the home, or at the, university campus, or wherever you are, and saying, well, is that right or is that wrong? And what does that mean? And how do I interact with you? And really having that conversation. So I think that, I hear your concern, but I also think that I think it's a positive that we're even able to have these conversations, that we're having this conversation right now. I think that's a very, very exciting byproduct of all of this.
And Matilda, you talked about reading social cues before. Do you think men are up to the challenge?
I do. I agree with Fran. I think it's positive that we can have the conversation. I don't think there's any problem with it at all. I think that the idea that it's worrying that men have to consider if they're behaving appropriately is a bit of a backlash thing. I think that's an idea that...
women have been considering if we've been behaving appropriately for a very long time.
Absolutely.
I might add.
The idea that men have to consider... Yeah. It's true. The idea that men have to consider if they're doing the right thing or not as being a bad thing is, that's ridiculous. They should always be thinking, am I doing the right thing? Because that's just a human thing that we all do. And I think that, if we all look inside ourselves, we do know where the line is. But if you don't, there's plenty of information out there, that Fran or I have provided, that many other journalists have provided, that theorists, that educators have provided. And I think that the thing that I would say to any of you who think, somebody in my office, or my son, or my brother, or my husband, or whomever doesn't know, is just encourage them to do the education for themselves, because I think we do need to kind of radically re-educate ourselves and, our partners and our brothers and our friends, and, just look for it. The information is there. It's really easy to find, and that's the only way that we're going to fix it, is by kind of teaching ourselves how to behave better.
Next question.
One of the fundamentals of journalistic ethics has always been impartiality, and we still teach that. Leave yourself out of the story, it's not about you. But I'm wondering whether you think that that needs a new look, whether that's still appropriate. I know some journalism academics have suggested that perhaps transparency and saying where you stand so the reader knows, rather than pretending to be somebody with no opinions at all, which of course is ridiculous, would be more appropriate.
Yeah. So I think impartiality is essential to sort of really telling a story fairly and being able to hear and represent both sides. I also think that there are certain things that we can agree on as a society or community, that rape is wrong. I mean, so it's sort of, you have to use your common sense to an extent. But you also touched on this idea of transparency, which is something that I've thought about a lot in my previous role at the Times, and hopefully it won't horrify you too much to tell you that we have brought our reporters into certain stories. It's not something that we do all the time, but I think in many ways, I mean, it's sort of really kind of opening up a little bit with the reader and being quite transparent about sort of who we are and where we are and what we're doing. I don't think it's always helpful to have a reporter get between the story and the action and the reader, but I think sometimes it can be really, really incredibly useful, and it can really add some dimension as you sort of walk with the reporter through the story and sort of hear some of the questions that was raised for the reporter, and as they try to sort of unpack it and you try and unpack it. And at the end of that story, the reporter shouldn't be telling you what to think, but perhaps sharing a little bit about what they think or about their process or what they saw, that you can then draw your own conclusion.
I think impartiality is important, but not always possible. As an investigator, I try to be as impartial as possible. As a critic, I think it's virtually impossible. And I think critics who say that they're objective or impartial are liars. And I think, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a life writer, so I try to blend the two, and I think fluidity in those things is really important. But I think, as you said, transparency is the most important part of declaring when you are not being impartial. So putting yourself out there and saying, I'm not being impartial and this is why, is really important. So, like, for example, being a survivor means that if I'm, say, being critical about a work about sexual assault, means I always have to put forward why I'm not being impartial about that work. And, that's just something I can't be impartial about, but I'll always say why.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Thanks. I'm quite fascinated by the idea of the sort of chicken or the egg from the gender unit at the New York Times. And I heard Jodie Cantor on a podcast, and she was talking about the sort of sequence of events. And if I got it right, the gender unit kind of predates Harvey Weinstein, and that there was a very strategic decision that the New York Times made to look at gender, to mainstream it within the reporting that you were doing, then to look at the issue of sexual harassment, then what's the big untold story, Harvey Weinstein. And I think we can probably learn a lot from that. We've talked here in Australia about the gendered newsroom. We've talked about it at the New News Conference here, about a systemic change within a newsroom, sparking a movement that's leading to more systemic change, and the kind of the beauty of closing the loop on that. And I would like us to learn that lesson here in Australia and have more gender units. And I think there's some ways we can think about how we can do that. But have I gotten that right? And do you see that that's catching light, if you will, in the US and maybe abroad, that more in the industry are thinking we have to get this off the women's pages? It's absolutely fundamental to our core business.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there are a couple of things there. I think you're right in your sequencing. I think that that gender needs to be, square. We do not want to go back to women's pages at all. And I think that gender is to sort of look at gender as just a women's thing is not necessarily very helpful. So I feel like sort of really putting it squarely in the newsroom is just a way of ensuring that it is covered, like we cover all of the other things that we need to cover. So yeah, I mean, you've got it right. And I think I should probably also point out that there's, the way I see it anyway, there's so much more to gender than just Me Too and sexual harassment. And I don't want to downplay how essential those topics are. And that's really all we've been talking about all week. But, as we sort of... Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. It's workplace issues, it's equal pay, it's workplace issues as they sort of we can look at the red carpet and the fancy stuff that's going on at the top, but we can also look at abuses, in challenging industries, factory floors, hotel industries, women who are really being quite abused, who don't have a voice, who can't speak out, who would be endangered. I think you touched on that before, who would be endangered if they spoke out, or, deported. And then, of course, not even to mention the global women's issues, I mean, huge problems, access to education, access to healthcare. I mean, the list sort of goes on and on. So, fine, this week we're talking about sexual harassment and Me Too, and that is absolutely huge. But the way I see it, gender is just kind of a big umbrella label for something that is very big and very broad, and we need to hit right on the head.
I think we could cover that off in an hour. I think we've done a great job of that. And that means we have one last question.
Hi, this is a bit of an observation that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. It's about cat person, which, disclaimer, I really dislike that, but for other reasons. So after that came out, there was this great piece published in Overland by Evelyn Aralowin, and it was sort of a response to critiques of cat person, but also a critique of cat person. And so she kind of points out just the different standards that are held to white authors and authors of colour, just in terms of the take-up of their pieces and popularity and that sort of a thing. But she also raises some really kind of important questions about just the whiteness of the story and who the story is about and who can relate to the story and that sort of a thing. So I find it interesting that when we're kind of dissecting it here, we go straight to generation being the thing that's a really important divider in terms of its reception, which is important, but there's so many other, factors in this, class, race, that sort of a thing that really mediate who those stories speak to and don't. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that and why you think we tend to fall into that conversation instead.
I think you raise an absolutely essential point. I think that, the story is thought-provoking. I think that it's hard with, and I can't speak for the story. We did not publish it, and I did not write it. But it's hard for any piece of work to sort of touch on every possible issue and perspective. And I don't mean that makes it okay, but I sort of think, we talked about generational because that was the generational split, because that to me was sort of one way in to look at it. And I think there are, dozens of ways to look at it and dozens of things, as you rightly pointed out, that have been overlooked. And I mean, that's a conversation worth having. But I mean, you make a great point.
And from what you say, that's on a much wider scale, the New York Times is grappling with all of that when it comes to all of their news coverage.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is, again, gender is one part of this, but I mean, we need to be looking at, I mean, this is sort of the point that I was trying to make at the beginning, but we need to be seeing things from every side, and that means, having a pretty diverse workforce who brings a lot of perspectives to the table and can say, have you thought about it like this? Have you seen it from my point of view? That's really essential, and that's one of the things we're working really hard on right now.
For those of you who have been sitting here the whole time thinking, what the hell is cat person? We're out of time, so you can go and look that up and treat yourself over lunch to reading that. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Francesca Donner and Matilda Dixon-Smith.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.